I'm a local journalist, and my job is relentless. I had spent a lifetime chasing down truth from rumors and following news that would frequently take me out of my hometown of Troy, Michigan. In 2014, the editorial team asked me to follow a story from Detroit. Normally, I would jump on any opportunity to leave home, but at the time, I had a strange feeling holding me back. And part of it was due to my uneasiness driving after my shoulder surgery, and partly due to listening to my colleagues say that Route 75 is a paranormal magnet. I was pacing outside my boss's office, thinking of some sort of excuse to not go, and I noticed Frank packing up his desk. He was moving to another job outside of Troy, and that meant my chance for a promotion was maybe finally here. So, I decided to swallow my anxiousness and take on the story. I called my dad and asked if I can take his car, to which he replied, "Young journalists are not paid enough on their own yet. Detroit? Well, I can come along, and I'll stop at your Uncle Sean's place," my dad had answered me. I cringed from the inside, but agreed. We don't have much in common. I'm a timid antisocial. He is outspoken and loud. However, I really wanted the Detroit store to help me with the promotion, and the road trip would probably mean a lot to him too. Neither of us had any commitment after work, so we headed right out afterwards, straight down Route 75. He tried churning up some conversation, but I was tired and wanted to be fully awake the next morning. So I started to nod off in the car. Detroit is not far from Troy, but every second felt like an hour. I do not remember when I actually fell asleep. Probably when Dad started telling strange stories of strange creatures that had been seen lurking near Troy at nighttime. Maybe I should have been paying attention to this part. Not soon into the trip, I heard a loud thud, hitting my head on the car window as I was leaning towards. "Hey, are you up?" my dad said. "I think I saw something." "Probably, it was nothing," he whispered. I shook my head, no, and just answered in murmurs. It was dark. We were no longer on Route 75. I remember making frustrated remarks, but his attention was completely elsewhere. His hands gripping the steering wheel. "You were asleep. There was an accident on Route 75, and I knew a way to bypass it over here by the fairgrounds and the cemetery." I rolled my eyes as I reached in my pockets to open the map on my phone. I tried to unlock my phone, but realized it was completely dead. I was so fixated on reaching Detroit that it had slipped my mind to charge it before leaving. The car kept moving along, but then it seemed to slow down. I opened my eyes wider, turning towards my dad to see his eyes wide open and staring at the rearview mirror. I still remember the look of his face, his jaw hanging down. He kept driving ahead slowly, but his eyes were glued to the rearview mirror. Not knowing what was going on, I asked him to let me drive, while Dad kept asking me strange questions, not stopping. I asked him again to stop the car and switch seats with me. He was hesitant at first, but finally agreed. I got out of the car, and soon after getting out, a noise from off in the direction of the cemetery caught my attention. I was looking around to find the source. I scanned the horizon looking for whatever it was, and what I saw was nothing like I could have ever imagined. What I was seeing was a dark-haired, furry, wolf-looking creature, huge in size, about as big as a fully grown horse. I squinted my eyes, thinking it was a play of the light, but the bright yellow eyes that were staring back into mine were definitely real. Even though the creature was at least a few hundred feet away from us, his incredible size was clearly noticeable. Its presence behind our stopped car, looking towards us, was just something I could feel, even that far away. I'll never forget the feeling I had when I first looked at it. It was majestic. It had a sense of undeniable power. I felt it could make anybody feel shivers down their spine and make their hands quiver, just like how I felt in that very moment. However, I'm a journalist, so I decide I can capture this beast with my camera, show people what I saw. I very slowly moved my hand, reaching for the door handle, while also reaching for my camera. In my hand, I was moving slowly enough that I would not be noticed by the creature, who was still a distance away. Unlucky for me, I was wrong. The beast howled a cry at the most unbelievable spectrum and rose up back on its two back feet. Its muscled body was now easily 9 feet tall, and its dark fur made it seem even more ominous and horrifying. However, the strangest part of this vision was the creature's human-like build. It was striking. The only typical wolf features were the tail, the sharp set of paws at the end of each limb, and the snarling wolf head. By this point, my dad jumped inside the car to the passenger seat, and I had moved across the driver's side. He quickly helped me open the seat door and yanked me inside, yelling me to hit the accelerator. At first, I was in shock, but as he pushed my knee and slapped me to my senses, I shut the half-open door, pressing the pedal to its limit, without ever looking back in the rearview mirror. My hands were gripping the steering wheel, white-knuckled. I was still shaking as I drove away and tried to process what had just happened these past 1 to 2 longest minutes of my life. My father saw it too, and he knew what he saw but could not verbally acknowledge it. As far as I'm concerned, I hope it's the first and the last time I catch a glimpse of the notorious Dogman of Michigan. I've had a lot of unusual things happen to me in my life, but nothing so peculiar as that May 19th, 2017, when my husband and I visited the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast here in Massachusetts. What was supposed to be a spooky fun trip turned out to be the most frightening night of all our lives. And it wasn't the house that left the lasting memory, but what happened afterwards that really stuck with us. I was always fascinated with the supernatural. My husband was more of a skeptical type. I convinced him to come with me to one of America's most haunted sites to prove to him the existence of ghosts. We made a little bet. If he saw something he logically could not explain, well, I could go buy some new clothes and he'd have to accompany me on some other historically haunted places. If nothing ever happened, well, he appeared to be staged and I would never bother him with my paranormal fascination ever again. I knew I'd win. I could feel it in my blood. So, we started on our long drive down the highway to Fall River, Massachusetts. When we got to the bed and breakfast, we traveled with a small group and a very knowledgeable tour guide. We were able to see every room in the old Victorian home. Supposedly, the site was famous for a double murder from 1892. The daughter of Andrew Borden, Lizzie Borden, was suspected by many to have been the culprit of her father and stepmother's murder. But the court let her go, assuming she was innocent. After her court victory, she immediately sold the house. It was later turned into a bed and breakfast, but visitors were so often spooked. We stayed in the John V. Morse room, where Abby Borden was actually found murdered. We left the door shut, but during the night, it mysteriously popped open on us. I could feel the negativity in the air increasing. The temperature in the room had dropped considerably. I knew we were definitely not alone. My husband just groggily said the door had clearly not been shut tightly, and the airflow in the room was to blame for the door opening, not ghosts. He did complain, though, of the room being cold. As we sat up in bed, debating who was right, a shadow traveled across the hallway with no body accompanying it. We both clearly saw it, and I could tell from the look on his face that he was now a believer. We looked at each other, rushing for the exit. We only briefly stopped to pay for our stay before heading into the early morning darkness. We fumbled with our keys as we hurried toward the vehicle. That's when we saw it. It was a good way to describe this being. Half man, half dog, with the head of a canine. The creature was literally lurking around the barn that had been reconstructed into a gift shop. I couldn't speak. I was too stunned. Instead, I tugged on my husband's sleeve, and he was super focused on getting our stuff back into the trunk. He did not even notice that thing was standing upright on two legs. I took a step back. I didn't even mean to do it. It was sort of instinctual. I wasn't sure if what I was seeing at first was new, or maybe that something science had been experimenting on, or perhaps something mythical that man had not yet known about. I whispered to my husband as this canine-like creature plopped down on all fours and stared at us hesitantly. My husband, who was still traumatized by the sight of the ghost in the bed and breakfast, wasn't even noticing the creature approach us with a sort of wild curiosity. I bravely stepped past my husband and could now see the creature's vibrant, aggressive, intelligent eyes. Its head looked kind of like that of an Australian shepherd, and it was amazing, but frightening all at the same time. It kind of had like a mane, if that makes sense, and its arms and body was so muscular and wide, I couldn't imagine much standing in his way. This thing was utterly terrifying, but it had spotted patches of black all around the back, and its gaze had me rooted in place. I kind of wanted to lean forward to get a better look, but just then, my husband slammed the trunk, and the creature jumped off and ran to the back. I was kind of annoyed, and I turned and flashed my clueless spouse a look, asked what he did, if he saw that thing. He only shrugged, having clearly missed the whole thing. So we both climbed into the vehicle and began our long drive home. I could never get the encounter out of my mind, and even went with my best friend on vacation back to the same bed and breakfast, just hoping to see the creature that had been lurking outside this barn, just outside the view of others. We both saw some strange things we could not explain, not to mention all the paranormal activity surrounding the property. But sadly, like I just said, the Dogman wasn't the only thing. Though I never did see this creature again, this was also near a wooded area, and it was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had, and definitely one I will never forget as long as I live. It was late October 2017, close to Halloween, and I was living in New Hampshire at the time. Some friends and I decided to go to one of those big city Halloween parties, except we later figured out it was for teens. I thought it was going to be lame like all the other parties I'd been to in the past. Man, I could not have been more wrong if I tried. That Halloween night will stay with me for the rest of my life. My costume was pretty lame, but my mom had made it for me, and I did not want to hurt her feelings, so I wore it regardless. My friends were all dressed in way better costumes, but oh well. We were all ready to kick back and have some fun for the rest of the evening. There was just one catch. We had to cut through a notoriously creepy cemetery to get to this party. It had seemed to stretch on for miles. To me, it looked like a sea of endless tombstones. I really appreciated the eerie atmosphere, though. It was perfect for something strange to happen. My friends and I were all striking poses in some creepy old granite mausoleum with a bunch of columns in front of it. The place looked really old. They all waved to me to join them in their photo shoot, but my eyes were fixed on something different entirely. And that's when things got really weird. As I got closer, peering out from beyond the shadows of the mausoleum was a pair of bright yellow eyes. It was as if they were silently beckoning me, Curiously and almost in a trance from their glow, I stared past my friends and continued to close the gap between myself and whatever it is. As I got closer, I can make out a snout and dark gray fur. A low, guttural growl escaped its smoky gray muzzle. It didn't sound like a growl of malice. It was more like some kind of restless discontentment. Its head slowly peeking out of the shadows. Under the bright moonlight, I could see it much more defined. Its body covered in fur and a head to its collarbone. But the upper torso was completely human, yet almost triangular in build, with its massive muscle arms that all seemed to thin out, right down to the waist. From there, the body became canine again. Its long and fluffy tail stood erect behind it, as it decided whether or not I was friend or foe. I held out my hand like I would any new dog I was meeting for the first time. I took a few hesitant steps towards me, and then stopped just as quickly. Under better lighting, I could see the bits of medium brown fur hidden with the gray-black strands. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I mean, part of me wanted to touch the fur on its head. And the yellow eyes were horrifyingly captivating. They were wild and kind of evil, actually. It was strange. So I kind of seemed locked in this trance, like it was capturing its prey, and I felt nothing except going towards it more and more slowly. This thing came towards me. I could see the reflection of the moisture on its black nose. I knew this was much more than a person in a costume. But even though it was vicious, it had not yet attacked me. It was more intelligent than that, like it was planning on something. Suddenly, my boyfriend motioned to me with his arm, as he called over to me to rejoin the group. I gasped at the sound of his voice. It must have startled the creature, for it froze in place and analyzed where the sound had come from. Very intelligently looking, mind you. Its ears kind of twitched and it rushed back into the shadows. It was terrifying. This thing did not belong in this realm. People might turn into some sort of strange experiment or something. I don't know. I was relieved. Who knows what it would have done to me had I actually made my way to it. It's almost like it mind-controlled me. I almost wonder if there's more of them. I mean, there had to have been more than one for it to physically exist. I thought about it the rest of the night, but never told them what exactly I saw. I mean, something like that on a Halloween night? How many people get to say they experienced that? I just remember how incredibly bright it was that night. That's the only reason I saw as many details as I did. I thought I saw that same familiar gray-black-brown of its body slipping into the nearby trees, but after squinting, I couldn't exactly see, not without the proper lighting. That was the last time I ever saw a strange creature, at least like that. Later on, though, I would eventually tell my friends about what I'd witnessed. My boyfriend just thought I was imagining things, and just saying, "Yeah, the darkness played tricks in your eyes. You're being too dramatic." And maybe my friends thought I was trying to set the mood for spooky fun. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that harrowing account. Never. I used to be a canvasser for a consumer protection organization. For those who don't know what that means, a canvasser is somebody who walks around town, going door to door, knocking on strangers' doors, with a clipboard to ask for donations or spread awareness for a specific cause. The cause we were all working on was pipelines, and the governor's lack of commitment to limit pipelines and new oil and gas infrastructure in the state. As you might imagine, it's a tough job, both physically, because we each walked about 10 miles a day at work, and emotionally, because the most common response to our knock was a shut in the face. Also, I've been threatened with a gun. I've been hit on by a clearly naked person, and I've had the cops called on me more than my fair share. But honestly, I kind of get it. We're interrupting these people at home without their permission. And yes, as late as 8:30 at night. We're strangers, and I specifically am a rather large bearded man. I wouldn't harm a fly, and I consider myself a rather jovial, carefree person. But random people don't know that when they see me walking up to their house. So again, I get some more of their extreme reactions to a certain extent. One night, though, I'll never forget this. I got the crap scared out of me. I knocked on a door, and nobody answered. Next house. I knocked on the door, chatted with the nice guy for a few moments, and although this did not result in any donations or anyone signing up to become a member of my organization, I always appreciated nice small talk chats to break up the monetary perpetual rejection. Finally, I came up to one of the last houses on my route. It looked like it used to be some sort of old Gatsby-esque house, but it had fallen into disrepair. I knocked on the door, and in an instant, it swung open. This woman with large, glassy black eyes and a face full of wrinkles, wearing a white nightgown with messy white hair, was staring at me. She stared at me so intensely, it felt like her eyes could cut right through me, leaving a hole in the sidewalk behind me. Her eyes were lifeless. I gulped audibly. I didn't even know until that moment that was the real thing people do when they're scared. I managed to open my mouth, but just barely squeak out a "Hi, ma'am," when the door swung shut in front of me, so hard I thought it might break. While this might sound like a normal encounter on paper, there was something so intense, so unnerving about that woman's empty stare that it sent me on edge for the rest of the night. Honestly, I would never tell my boss this. I just filled out the rest of my sheet saying everybody else was not home, so that I would not have to keep working. I took out my phone to watch YouTube or maybe text my friends. Anything to take my mind off that woman. But I had no signal, so I decided to just walk around a bit. As I walk along the empty streets, I realize there's something creepy about the suburbs when you're the only one on the street and all the house lights are off. When it's quiet and still like that, you realize you were just exposed. Every horror movie you've ever seen comes back to you, and you imagine that Freddy Krueger is right behind you, posed to attack. I kept walking down these empty streets looking for any sign of life, so that I'd feel better. I knew my boss was not backing me up, and I'll tell you what, that scared me. It was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I turned a corner and saw some houses with their lights on, and decided to head that way. Like I said, I was done working for the night. That lady definitely shook me up too much to have any real motivation, but just knowing there were other people awake calmed my nerves. It's not real protection, but it's psychological ease of mind. I was walking towards the houses and already beginning to feel a little bit better. That's when I heard a ruffling in the trees alongside me. My heart dropped. I decided to pick up the pace, and to my horror, the ruffling followed me and picked up its pace too. I considered running, but the rational side of my brain took over, and I realized that whatever this was probably just an animal, and that if it was an animal, it could easily outrun me. So my best bet was to make myself big and make loud noises to scare it off. I have no idea if this works for every predator, but that's what I went with. I got up as big as I could with my clipboard in my hand and yelled, "Ugh!" towards the trees. To my shock and absolute terror, the creature in the woods raised itself up too and made itself bigger. And in that moment of horror, that's when I got my first real look at it. The first thing I noticed was its paws, how huge they were. And my first thought was that I royally messed up with this bear. Then I saw the fur. It was kind of dark and not really like a bear's. So I started to calm down, thinking maybe this was just some sort of big dog. But then it raised its head above the small brush. That's when I realized this thing was a wolf. Well, not a wolf. It had a wolf's head. But it also had that unmistakably man's body. At first, maybe this was some sicko wearing an advanced wolf mask, like in the movie Saw or something, but it opened its mouth, and I clearly saw saliva dripping out of its mouth, and the deep shine in its eyes. I realized in that moment, this was no mask. This was somehow a creature with the body of a human, and the features of a wolf. I was too scared to move. The wolfman creature took one step towards me, and my first instinct was to hurl my clipboard at it. I will never, to the day I die, stop being grateful that my clipboard made contact and promptly distracted this creature for a couple of seconds. It seemed distracted and kind of grumbled, and you bet that I took that time to run as fast as I could. You know what? At that point, screw my job, I don't even care. So I ran down the street, got a good signal, called my boss, and told him, "You need to pick me up now. I don't care. This is urgent. Come here now." Well, thankfully he listened. There was more than enough urgency in my voice for him to accept what I was telling him. But even when we got in the car, I never told my boss what I saw, and he never asked me. But he knew something was up. My body language and the look on my face told me everything. I quit my job a week later. When I was a kid, I went on a class field trip to celebrate the 100th day of school. It was a tradition in our high school that every year we'd all vote on a list of places to go. Whichever place got the most votes. In my year, we chose Glacier National Park. I remember literally running home the school the day they gave us the permission slips for my parents to sign. They signed, of course, and I couldn't even sleep that night. I was so excited. I had to start mentally preparing. All I could think about was hiking and being out in the trees and mountains and all the amazing wildlife. Of course, I was just a teenager, so the idea of bears was appealing to me rather than scary. But I really wanted to see elk and moose and wolves. All the fun stuff that I did not have a chance to see growing up in the relatively populated Columbia Falls. In case you couldn't tell already how bored I was by everyday life, after handing in my slip, I spent days pursuing online retailers, looking at hiking gear and everything, watching documentaries and countless YouTube videos. What turned my interest from a spark to a full-on explosion was the announcement that our school was going to hold a big sale to raise money for us to stay there overnight. I was ecstatic. Little did I know that I would see something on that trip that would not only ruin my love for the outdoors for a while, but also sent me to therapy for years following. After months of anxiously waiting, or maybe weeks, but certainly felt like months, the day arrived, obviously, and I could not sleep the night before. I just had to keep double-checking, triple-checking, making sure everything was packed. I made sure to bring extra film, got my sunscreen, my bug spray, and kept thinking about all the wonderful adventures we'd go on to as a class. And as you can imagine, the trip was kind of a letdown. Of course, the park is gorgeous, and eating lunch amidst the mountains was insanely cool. I'll never forget that. But the trip was mostly educational. We learned about all the different stuff, the difference between deciduous and coniferous trees. We learned about the mountains and the different layers of rock and soil that likely went into their composition. As an adult looking back on this trip, this actually does sound kind of interesting, and I've gone back and looked up some of this information again. But as a 14-year-old, every science fact spouted by our teacher just robbed me of little hope. More hope that I'd end the day by riding a bear or making friends with a group of elk. As the day wound down, light turned into night, and we all had some free time to goof off. Play our Game Boys, whatever. I didn't have many friends in class yet since this was my first year, and I was coming from a middle school a few towns away, and my family had just moved. Anyway, Eventually, dinner was ready. So I sat down next to this kid, Brian. We kept chatting and he introduced me to his friends, Margaret and Pete. I recognized the girl from around school, but had no idea who Pete was. Turns out he sat behind me, and Brian and I just never noticed him. We ate dinner, and as soon as the plates were cleared and everybody was back in by free time, we ducked out and made our escape. Margaret stuck out first, and she was almost caught. Next was Brian and then Pete. Finally me. My heart was racing as I evaded the menacing teachers. I had never done anything this daring before, which is why I was so excited to even just step foot in a national park. We were grouped just a few yards away from all the other kids. In retrospect, we were definitely still within eyesight, but we felt like four little Indiana Joneses, trekking our way through the wilderness. To any kids listening to this right now, I cannot stress enough, this was a stupid idea. We could have all been seriously injured, and no adults would have known where we were to help. But we were young and dumb. Once we're sufficiently far from everyone else, and giddy, we turn on our flashlights. Sure enough, we were kind of lost. We were exhilarated, but, as kids do, completely failed to make a plan. That's when we realized something was wrong. We turned a corner, and we saw something that scared the crap out of all of us. Nobody would believe us, but what we all saw was real. We saw a creature with the head of a wolf and the body of a man. At first, I thought it was somebody wearing a mask, but it let out this deep growl that sent my heart racing and my brain into panic mode immediately. That's when Brian shrieked, and luckily, that was enough for this thing to turn around and sprint off into the woods. Except it didn't run away. It was following us, coming after us as we ran, hiding in the woods for cover, but still staying right with us. We could hear it sprinting and its heavy thuds as it galloped alongside of us, probably waiting for the right opportunity to reach out and grab one of us and cover. That's when I saw brief flashes of its hind legs, and where I expected to see its paw come out and grab one of us, I saw some kind of misshapen foot-paw hybrid. We all kept running and eventually made it back to camp without anybody being grabbed or snatched or eaten. Nobody had even realized we had left. I know my encounter's short, but to this day, whenever we talk, which is rare, we will still talk about that night, what we saw, and our shared struggle that nobody will believe us. This happened just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I have never considered myself to be superstitious. In fact, I have taken to building a career on the breaking down of this world's superstitious elements, having studied and worked in the fields of anthropology. Yet, despite this, one particular encounter that I had as a child stands out in my memory, never fading. One that by all accounts borders on the supernatural, and in the least, will go without explanation for a long time to come. I was a young girl when it happened, just 10 years old, and it was a Saturday, November 20th. I was with my best friend at the time, a young girl named Cindy, and we decided to spend our entire weekend at Penn Museum to research a school project. Cindy's father was a curator at the museum, and he gave tours on ancient civilizations, which granted us behind the scenes to the ancient Egyptian artifacts. We were also happy to be with a treasure trove of knowledge. Although we were young children whose passions lied elsewhere at the time, all the artifacts and knowledge that they had on display were truly awe-inspiring, and it could very well have been prompted by my interest in science. As Cindy and I decided to make full use of our time in the museum by exploring as much of all the exhibits as we could. It was already dark outside when we finally settled down in the ancient Egyptian exhibit and began to work on our projects. Actually, the museum was already closed to visitors, and Cindy's father urged us to hurry it up so we can make it home in time for dinner. I was staying near the museum in a small apartment, with my mom who would work in the city. My school was also nearby too, so it was convenient. Cindy's father asked whether anybody was coming to pick me up, and I told him that my mother would come to pick me up. He seemed reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to let me leave the museum. I gave our project to Cindy for safekeeping and headed out of the museum, ready to go home. And although it might seem dangerous for a young 10-year-old girl to be walking around the streets of Philadelphia alone at night, it was something I had done before this incident, so I figured this time it wouldn't be any different. There was a rather big stretch of forest that I would have to cross in order to get home, which did worry me a bit. This was dark after all, but it was private land and it was near the university, which meant there's a lot of patrolling security in the area. I mean, I figured if something happens or somebody tries to mug me or hurt me, I figured I could flag down somebody. So I almost immediately picked up on a very strange smell, one that reminded me of a wild animal. It kind of smelled like wild dog or something. I don't know, like wet dog and stink. Anyway, I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, but since the patch of urban forest was near Penn Park, I figured it could have been an elk or deer. Maybe the owner of the land was trying his hand at farming. But as I progressed further, the smell became much more pronounced, as I went so deep into the property that for a second, I forgot I was in the city. And as I made it halfway through the property, the smell now soon turned into an actual sound I could hear. It started with twigs breaking underfoot and some crunching. I could tell whatever it was making the sound was rather large. I paused for a second, and whatever was making the sound seemed to pause in sync with me. I looked around in hopes of seeing what was making the noise and giving off this awful feral scent. I caught a large silhouette in the corner of my eye. I focused my head toward it and almost fell flat on my back when I saw it. A couple of feet in front of me, a 7-foot-tall, monstrously built creature, covered from head to toe in fur. Its head was that of a wolf or a canine, with the rest of its body like that of a well-built man. It almost resembled that of a silverback gorilla, in body of course, with the head of a wolf. I literally couldn't figure out what I was seeing. The whole time I was watching it stood totally upright, like a man would. And as I picked myself up off the ground, this thing proceeds towards me, which in turn prompted me to bolt towards the nearest point of exit. I had far too much adrenaline going through me. As I came hurtling towards the nearest street, a car pulled up alongside me, and it was none other than Cindy and her father, who said he had followed me in his car when he saw me walking alone, but that I entered the property with the trees before he could offer me a ride. I told him what I'd seen, and although I could see he didn't exactly believe me on what I had seen, we did call the police to investigate. In turn, they tracked down and contacted the owner to confirm that there were signs of some sort of large unknown canine on the property, although nobody could say for sure. Perhaps one day with the tools I've acquired in training and practice in archaeology, that mystery is something I could finally answer.